This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 105 of Here's How for the 9th of June 2020. Political debate, notably from the right, has got much more bitter and partisan in recent years. On this podcast, I'm talking to a campaigning journalist who says that the left must respond in kind.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Coming up in a few minutes, didn't Jeremy Corbyn in particular and the Labour Party essentially fail to deal with that level of attack?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a good brief answer on that. So move on to my second. That's coming up shortly. But first, I want to say thank you to all my donors on Patreon, especially Andrei Balkanasu, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate everyone who does that. Patreon is a website that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you think that you could do the same as Andrei and the other donors, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. And it really is good to get feedback from listeners and to know that there's a growing number of listeners out there. I always appreciate that as well. And it doesn't matter to me whether those listeners are ordinary people interested in the world around them, ordinary working stiffs, or whether they're celebrity fans. I'm just happy to know that there's anyone out there at all. I know that some people might be wowed by the rich and famous, but I try to keep a bit more grounded than that. But I have to admit that I had a little frisson of excitement to find out that I have one very well-known fan. That's right, folks, you're listening in the august company of none other than the billionaire financier Dermot Desmond. How do I know that? Because he sent me a fan email. Well, of course, he didn't send it to me himself. It was sent by Suzanne McNulty, his legal counsel. And looking over it again, it doesn't come across so much as a fan letter. You see, in podcast episode 101, we were talking about housing with Labour Party councillor Alison Gilliland, and in the show notes, I referred to what I thought was a pretty good article written by my new best friend Desi, that's what I call him, and Desi listed some excellent suggestions for fixing the housing crisis. And I couldn't really mention that and just ignore the fact that he was very close to the architect of many of the problems that we have in Ireland to this day, Charlie Haughey. Anyway, this is the email that Suzanne McNulty sent me. I am Mr. Dermot Desmond's legal counsel. Your allegation that Mr. Desmond was found by various investigations to have paid large amounts of money, often through secretive bank accounts, to corrupt political figures and to have falsely claimed that those payments were loans, are both offensive and defamatory. I request that you immediately remove the offending article from your website and any other media and publish an apology to Mr. Desmond in terms to be approved by me, making a full, unequivocal retraction of these false and defamatory allegations. By way of compensation, Mr. Desmond would also like you to make a charitable donation of €1,000 to Respect. She went on to threaten to sue me if I didn't comply. The problem there is that the Moriarty Tribunal found that my new BFF Desi paid huge sums of cash to Haughey and his sidekick PJ Mara on top of funding the refurbishment of Haughey's yacht to the tune of £75,000. A vast sum at the time that would have bought you a mansion worth in the millions now. The claim that these payments were loans is important because if it was true, then there would be no tax due on the payment. But of course, there were no loan agreement documents, there was no security, there was no agreed interest rate, There was no agreed repayment schedule, and there was never any evidence that repayments were ever made. And the little fact that some of the payments were routed through the notorious Ansbacher Cayman Bank didn't exactly make them less suspicious. For that reason, when they found out about the payments, Revenue demanded that Haughey pay tax on them. And since he didn't have a leg to stand on to argue the point, Haughey paid. Desi told the Moriarty Tribunal the same story. They were just loans, honestly, Gov. Moriarty didn't buy it either. The fact that one payment to Haughey of 200,000 old Irish pounds came exactly one day after Desi had benefited from a property deal when the then nationalised Telecom Éireann overpaid his consortium by a gigantic amount was, of course, entirely coincidental. So what I wrote was exactly the truth. Desi paid huge sums of money to notoriously corrupt politicians. Some of that money was routed through secretive bank accounts, and his claim that the money was a loan was false and found to be so by a tribunal of inquiry. What happened then? Not much. I wrote back to Suzanne McNulty asking her to point out anything that I had said that was untrue. I haven't heard back. What she did do was threaten my web hosting firm in the US, who told me that they didn't want the hassle and basically would close my account if I didn't remove the text mentioning Dermot Desmond. So I removed the text, but that isn't the same host that hosts the audio of the podcast, so I guess we'll see whether this text or audio stays up. As for my new billionaire fan, he might do well to remember the Streisand effect. And you're complaining that what I said was offensive? What are you going to do? Have me charged under the Offences Against the Feelings Act? If you're thinking of threatening me again, Desi, I refer you to Arkell versus Prestram. Look it up.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line, I have Kerry-Ann Mendoza. Kerry-Ann is the editor-at-large of The Canary, and she's also the author of a book called Austerity, Demolition of the Welfare State and the Rise of the Zombie Economy, which was published a few years ago. Kerry-Ann, The Canary, for people who are not familiar with it, what exactly is that website?
So we set up The Canary in 2015 essentially as an antidote to what we saw as failings of the establishment media to examine left-wing perspectives of the crises that are facing our country, whether it's austerity or the kind of political crises we have now. We're independently regulated, independently funded by our readers. And we provide news 24/7.
Okay, and might you be a left-wing version of Fox News or Breitbart?
I think that's an accusation that can be levelled at us only from a position of ignorance.
Enlighten us then.
Well, we're independently regulated, so we are held to a standard. If people find complaint with what we do, they not only have recourse through us, and one of our mandatory policies is that we make corrections of our mistakes at the same volume or louder than we make those mistakes. So that means correcting on all our social media channels in capital letters and being accountable for that mistake. And if that remedy isn't enough, then people are able to file a complaint with Impress, our independent regulator. We have no, unlike the establishment media who sit on their own complaints boards, we don't do that. It's an external regulatory process. People can complain and then we're held to account by Impress. And in our entire time, we've only had 2 complaints upheld against us versus more than 15,000 articles published, which gives us an error rate of below 0%, which, one mistake is too many for me, but I'll take that.
Okay. Would it be fair, am I correct in saying that at least some of your writers are paid based on how many page impressions their articles get? Are you sort of a clickbaity sort of website? Do you try hard to promote yourself on social media?
Absolutely not. That's actually not our business model anymore. In fact, it was only our business model for the very first couple of months that we started. And that was simply because we were launched with £500 of our own money.
Okay.
We didn't have an infrastructure where we could pay salaries because we simply didn't have that revenue. So what we needed to do was figure out a fair way of rewarding people for generating income for us. And that's what we did. And the moment that we could get away from that, we did. And that happened within a few months. And now our actual income is 80% subscriber income. So it's entirely unrelated to how our articles perform on social media.
Okay, and I got in touch with you because I'm very interested in a Twitter thread that you wrote, and it was about a guy called Dominic Cummings. He's very well known to everybody in Britain. He might not be so well known to people outside Britain, but he is essentially perhaps the brain certainly behind the vote leave, the vote for the UK to exit the EU, and he is now the chief advisor for Boris Johnson, the very Brexity Prime Minister. And I'm just going to read one of the tweets in that thread that you wrote. And it says, "We have to fight in this culture war now because the other side is fighting and winning." And you're referring to Cummings specifically in that. "That means getting down and dirty. Construct a narrative, repeat it incessantly, force them to defend it, move instantly onto the next without giving them a moment's pause. Wear them down." Why do you want to do that?
Because we're dealing with people inside of a culture war. These are not normal times. So it's almost like you're dealing with people in a way that you would deal adult to adult. So adult to adult, someone makes a mistake. The assumption is if you explain that mistake to them in a sufficient fashion, their response will be to admit that mistake, be accountable for it, and do everything that they can to not repeat that mistake. But those are not the people we're dealing with. We're essentially interacting with people that have exhibited the emotional maturity of toddlers. So you point out the mistake, they deny it. You prove that they made that mistake, they either make an excuse or move on to something else entirely and drop a dead cat in the middle of the whole thing.
Give me an example of a mistake like that.
Well, the Cummings fiasco that we're in at the moment, where you have the guy who sits in the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies meetings, devises the lockdown rules, and then flouts them. And first of all, he denies flouting them. So the Guardian and the Mirror got together and proved that he had flouted them. And then he came out and said, well, yes, I flouted them, but it doesn't matter. And then they insist, oh, but wait, but it does matter because, there are actual repercussions of you breaking that lockdown rule, not only directly, but indirectly through the impact of other people's behaviour as a result of what you've done. And so then they start rewriting the lockdown rules entirely. To say, well, no. And it goes on incessantly. And all the while that's happening, they are just getting as much nefarious other stuff done as they possibly can. And by the time that sort of the media exhausts itself on this issue, he will laugh and then he'll just tell us another lie. So it's completely counterproductive. You,
Kellyanne, you very much, when we were doing the setup, you very much set yourself up as an alternative to the mainstream media and very much on the left. Yeah. Do you think it's fair to say that both the mainstream media and perhaps commentators on the left have been failing to cope with that new strategy that people, for example, involved with the Brexit campaign in the UK, perhaps with Trump in the US, the left and the mainstream media have been failing to deal with their new tactics for at least the past few years?
No, I would say that the centre and the right have, because we don't have left-wing commentators in the mainstream space. But
the mainstream have failed, and the left, such as it is, we'll say outside of the canary, haven't responded well, or haven't responded at least effectively to that.
They just haven't been there. That's the issue. So this approach hasn't even been able to galvanize in any kind of scale, because almost, if you imagine, the centre essentially fought the culture war not against the right but the left. So kind of applied. It's funny actually, if you see now the Cummings and the Boris Johnsons of the world are now applying exactly the same techniques on those centrist commentators that those centrist commentators applied to the left during the Corbyn era.
Roll back, explain that for somebody, and you're clearly somebody on the left, but for someone who is willing to listen to you but doesn't necessarily share all of your viewpoints, explain how you think that happened.
So you have a situation where they constructed a number of entirely artificial crises around the left, whether it's, anti-Semitism, which by any measure, by the measures of statistics, and there have been several landmark studies by, universities like LSE and others that established that there was no anti-Semitism crisis within the Labour Party. In fact, that anti-Semitism levels within the Labour Party were lower than those in most other political parties.
But that was a big narrative in British news for quite some years.
But what they did was just kept daily, literally daily for 4.5 years, continuing to repeat this narrative that they knew to be false, we knew to be false, the statistics proved were false, but nevertheless maintained that narrative and that constant sense of crisis around the Corbyn leadership, and that forced them to almost capitulate to something they knew wasn't true, but that they felt they couldn't counter because they were unwilling to fight on culture war terms.
This was something that very much in the public eye damaged Jeremy Corbyn, the now ex-Labour Party leader.
Yeah, and it damaged him in multiple ways. It damaged him for people who weren't natural Labour Party supporters, because what they saw was this guy constantly unable, apparently, to deal with this anti-Semitism crisis that didn't actually exist.
Okay, I've got two branches. Carry on. I've got two ways I want to branch this. And one thing I want to do is I want to ask you, and we'll get onto it in a minute, are you going to do essentially the same thing to them, however honestly or nobly? But other than that, I just want to ask you, wasn't it really a failing of them that, sure, they were getting attacked, and that was a pretty good tactic on the part of the right in the UK, so that essentially when anybody picked up an average newspaper, if they were reading about the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn in particular, there somewhere in there they were talking about anti-Semitism and a crisis and so forth. That was a pretty good tactic. Didn't Jeremy Corbyn in particular and the Labour Party essentially fail to deal with that level of attack?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a good brief answer on that. So move on to my second part of that question then, or the alternative question on that, which is, are you proposing to do the same to your political enemies via your website and via other campaigning?
That's what we have to do. It's that there really isn't any other option right now, because, and that's been established, that how many times are we willing to lose? It's where I go in the thread that you picked up originally on social media, and we're actually releasing a video on this issue tonight to lead people through that in a little more detail. The central question is, how many hurt, hungry, homeless, sick or dead Britons? Because the problem we're in now is that we're applying a level of civility to ourselves, which is actually, I think, an abdication of moral responsibility in the level of crisis we're facing.
So would another way of saying that be essentially the left has been playing nice for too long, and by playing nice guys lose, and you feel it is more important to win than it is to be nice?
It's not even about being nice. It's about being clear and being determined and being unwilling to allow yourself to be boxed into corners by cheats and liars. And that is what is continuing to happen, because there's always a pressure on the left to appear quote unquote reasonable, but it doesn't actually mean reasonable. It basically means compliant, mealy-mouthed, kind and gentle. And actually that is not appropriate in the face of the level of death and destruction that we're up against. In the same way as a nation, in normal times, you would pursue diplomacy, conversation, cooperation, trade, all of those things. Those are peacetime actions. But if another hostile nation is attacking you and threatening to kill your people and take over your nation, the responsible and reasonable action to take in that context is to go to war.
Okay, so
that is your last resort, but it is the appropriate resort in that context. So then,
what exactly are you proposing? Give me an example of a narrative that you would use to, as you would see it, attack the right wing in British politics.
I think this is way beyond just what the Canary can do or what one or two independent media outlets can do. Mm-hmm. And what we're discussing at the moment is the fact that we as a populace, as the demos in democracy, need to appreciate our leverage, and we need to apply it across the system in every way we know how. Mm-hmm. And that means we stop working, we stop paying our rent, we stop buying non-essential goods, we target the systems in ways that protect our communities but hurt capital. And we also need to protect each other from the inevitable sanctions that will attempt to be levelled against us and the most vulnerable of us for doing that. The benefit of this happening now is that coronavirus means that, and the failure of our government to address the impacts of coronavirus means a lot of this groundwork is already being created. We have incredible mutual aid groups and networks across the country managing crises of hunger, absence of food, absence of money, all of these issues at a local level. So it really is about galvanising civil groups, activist groups, unions, independent media, and the rest of us to take this fight back upwards. And the reason we have to do it is because it's being proven, I think, time and again now, this isn't going to be a top-down solution. We have got to the stage where our democracy has become so corrupted that really the people waiting in the wings to take over at this point will simply replicate to a greater or lesser degree exactly the same political crisis that we have been in for decades.
Okay, hold with that thought for a moment, because I want to focus mostly on just media activism to begin with. Can you give me, in the way that you say that anti-Semitism, the charge of anti-Semitism, the accusation of anti-Semitism was used against the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn in particular in Britain. Can you give me a narrative that you might hit back with to damage, for example, Boris Johnson, the Conservative Party?
Yeah, I'd replay their narrative directly back at them. It's about making them, to their core demographic, unappealing. Because obviously the rest of us are already outraged. So it's not about the sort of things that would outrage us, it's about the things that would outrage them. And they are very anti-establishment, they are anti-elites, and they have this concept of fairness and fair play at the heart of things. And those instincts were distorted first by the Leave campaign, but later by the Conservative Party itself, in order to almost misdirect that thoroughly justified anger actually against the wrong groups. So instead of targeting, Boris Johnson, who is, I don't think you can get more establishment than an Eton and Oxford educated trust fund aristocrat. So it's about putting that anger to work, but on the groups that it should be. So, the line that is circulating now is perfect. One rule for them, another for us, over and over and over and over again. And you find, they take one example and say, no, that's not one rule for us and another for you. And then you find another example of it. And and you hit them with that, and you hit them again and again and again, until the only conversation that is happening anywhere in this country about the Conservative Party is that it is one rule for them and another for us. And there will be ample evidence all over the place. The benefit that we have, the advantage that we have in this scenario, is it's actually true. We don't have to invent a crisis. We don't have to invent the idea that there is one rule for them and another for us, because it's amply demonstrably true. So we do not struggle to find examples, and we don't need to make up examples and break our own bounds of integrity and decency. We simply need to get so much more effective at sticking to that line and beating them with it until they submit.
Okay, what demographic are you targeting that message at?
I think it needs to be the sort of the Labour heartlands that went to, it's basically the swing voter. You're never going to reach the arch, Cummingsite, Johnsonite, bigoted, anti-immigrant, Little England person. That's not going to happen. That those people are zealots. They're not reachable. So we don't do that. And actually we shouldn't be in any way endorsing those sort of hostile, racist, prejudicial attitudes. I think that's one of the mistakes the Labour Party makes, is it thinks, oh, we need to win over those people by throwing black people and brown people under the bus. Catastrophic mistake. What we need to do is target the swing voter that actually feels their sense of fairness. They do have a concept that actually the welfare state is important, that sharing is important, that helping each other out and community spirit is important, and that those things are under threat. But they're not under threat from immigrants or brown people that were born here or any of these things. They're under threat from a group of entitled, privileged people that are in Westminster. And we can vote them out, and we can elect people who will represent us.
Carrie-Anne, there is a debate going on now, for example, in the US, and I think it has been perhaps not the debate, but certainly the electoral fight has been won by Joe Biden, a very centrist Democrat, as opposed to a more left-wing Democrat in Bernie Sanders. And that debate, I think, is going on in Britain as well. You're firmly on the side, I think, of the more radical, more leftist supporters of the Labour Party.
Yep.
The centrists, the centrists would say that by the time of the next election, when the next election comes in the UK, which is scheduled in 2024, there will have been no Labour Party Prime Minister elected, except one, Tony Blair, who was the absolute pinnacle of centrism. The left and the Labour left have never have
Prime Minister.
Yes, but the left of the Labour has never won.
That's the issue. It's not that your point is invalid. So your point is absolutely valid, and it also proves the point that we have been in a political crisis for a long time. It is simply not okay that we are only permitted prime ministers in this country which accord with the values of an elite group and their interests. That is a crisis of democracy. It is a crisis of media plurality. It's a crisis for all of us. Because what happens is those candidates don't actually appeal to us. They appeal to essentially press barons, Rupert Murdoch and others, and they give them the gloss that allows them to sell themselves to the public through those mainstream media organs, or they don't, and then they don't. And you have an example in Tony Blair in which he made that bargain, and the decisions that he then went on to make for this country in order to retain that power were devastating. They were absolutely devastating to this country. We have not recovered from them yet. And so in terms of that whole argument is predicated on accepting an unfair and dangerous status quo. And I think ultimately, if we believe in democracy, if we consider ourselves democratic people, a civilized country, then we simply cannot allow that situation to continue permanently.
But deal with the point that whenever the Labour Party has been controlled by the left, it has simply failed to get elected.
That is the point. I just dealt with it. It's unacceptable. I'm not simply going to accept an unjust status quo because that's the status quo.
Okay, you say there that you're not permitted to have somebody outside of that status quo, permitted by the electorate, surely?
No, that's the point I made about the weaponizing of propaganda in order to manufacture consent for an unfair status quo. So what you can either do is say, okay, well, I accept the terms of that game and I will continue to allow this country to go to the dogs, or we have to act. And we act in these ways. We organise, we raise the level of political awareness across the public. And by that way, we actually challenge the systems rather than simply submitting to them, which is effectively what the Labour Party has done. It is no longer a party that even presents itself as representing the interests of working class people in this country. That's the point of the Labour Party. If you're not that, there's no point of you. We have 1 million, food parcels going out. We have the UN sending special reporters here to analyse our human rights violations. This is serious. This is a crisis. And the only reason everyone isn't freaking out is because is a process of hyper-normalisation has taken place, which the media has its role in.
Let me just ask finally, is there a danger that what you're proposing will cause so much division? And we know that there's been a huge polarisation in the political spectrum. Is there a danger that you're doing something dangerous there by driving a wedge into the centre of politics?
It already exists. We're already here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, anyone who's paying attention right now knows that this is the most terrifying time to be alive that most people can remember. You know, almost in living memory. We're now at the point where coronavirus has killed more people in this country than all of the UK civilians that died in the Second World War in the Blitz.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is just an astonishing statistic. And yet, the level of panic isn't there because, as I say, this process of hypernormalization has taken place that means that people just adapt to those circumstances, accept them as inevitable, and just do their best to hold on and survive it.
Kerry-Ann Mendoza, editor-at-large of The Canary at canary.co, and author of Austerity, Demolition of the Welfare State and the Rise of the Zombie Economy. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Brilliant, William. Thank you for having me on.
Make your view heard. Dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, follow Kerry-Ann Mendoza at The Mendoza Woman, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks again to Andre and all the other donors on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote more time to finding interesting new guests and doing research. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also, there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.